The coffee shop buzzed with morning energy, a symphony of espresso machines and chattering voices filling the air. Eduardo Mendez sat in his tailored Italian suit, his attention divided between the Wall Street Journal and his 5-year-old daughter, Sophia, who contentedly nibbled on a chocolate croissant. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the polished surface of his platinum watch, and the remnants of grief that still lingered in his eyes, especially visible when he thought no one was looking. 3 years since Elena's passing, and still the world felt slightly off-kilter, as if gravity itself had changed its rules. Eduardo's espresso sat untouched, its surface reflecting the overhead lights like tiny stars on an obsidian sky. "Daddy," Sophia's voice cut through his thoughts, her small finger pointing across the busy cafe. "That woman looks just like Mommy." Eduardo's heart stuttered. He followed Sophia's gaze, expecting to dismiss the observation as a child's wishful thinking. Instead, his cup slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the tiled floor. Near the back of the cafe, a cleaner with tied-back dark hair mopped the floor, her movements efficient but graceful. It wasn't her uniform or the mop that paralyzed Eduardo. It was her face, the same high cheekbones, the same curve of lips, the same warm brown eyes that had closed forever 3 years ago in a tragic car crash. The face of Elena, his late wife. "Impossible," Eduardo whispered, his voice lost beneath the cafe's ambient noise. The cleaner looked up at the sound of breaking ceramic. She rushed over with a rag, concern etched across features so hauntingly familiar that Eduardo had to grip the edge of the table to remain seated. "I'm so sorry, sir. Oh." Her voice faltered as her eyes met Eduardo's. Recognition flickered in her gaze, though it made no sense. She stumbled backward slightly, overwhelmed by the intensity of his stare, and the little girl who clutched his sleeve, gazing at her with wide, curious eyes. From behind the counter, the cafe manager stormed over. A tall, sour-faced man, with thin lips pressed into a permanent frown and a designer polo that strained against his belly. "Louisa, for the love of God, are you clumsy or just slow? You broke the customer's cup." "I didn't break anything," she started, flustered, her hands trembling slightly as she knelt to clean the mess. "I saw everything. First the floors, now the tables. Honestly, I don't know why we keep you here." "Enough," Eduardo interrupted, his voice low but glacial. "She didn't break the cup. I did." The manager blinked, stunned into momentary silence. "Sir, you should be ashamed," Eduardo continued, standing to his full height, suddenly aware of the privilege his tailored suit and commanding presence afforded him. "She was helping. You were humiliating." Eduardo turned to the woman, Louisa. The manager had called her, his tone softening like ice beneath a gentle flame. "Are you all right?" Louisa nodded, but her expression was unreadable, part shock, part recognition, part fear. Sophia tugged Eduardo's coat, her innocent voice carrying clearly in the now quiet cafe. "She looks like Mommy. Is she an angel?" "No, cariño," Eduardo said, struggling to keep his voice steady. She's real." The manager huffed and walked away, muttering under his breath about difficult customers. Eduardo knelt in front of Louisa, aware that his world was shifting beneath his feet. "Please, what's your name?" "Louisa. Louisa Oliveira," she said, her voice trembling slightly like leaves in a gentle breeze. "If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you." Continuing. Eduardo slowly sat back down, unable to tear his eyes from her face. Sophia scooted closer to him, half hidden behind his arm, but still peering curiously at the woman. "My wife, Elena. She passed 3 years ago," Eduardo explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "You look exactly like her." Louisa's hands shook visibly now. She set the rag aside, and after a moment's hesitation sat across from him, still in her cleaner's uniform, as if everything around them had vanished. "I was adopted," she said simply, the words falling between them like pebbles into still water. "All I know is I had a twin sister. I've searched for her for years, but I never found anything. Just a name. Helena." Nothing more. Eduardo felt the room tilt. Elena was born April 12, 1992 at San Luis Hospital in Chicago. Luisa's mouth fell open, her eyes widening. "That's my birthday, that's my hospital." Sophia smiled, unaware of the emotional earthquake surrounding her. "So that means you're my aunt." The woman's eyes welled with tears as she looked at the girl, then back to Eduardo. "I think so." 3 days later, Eduardo drove his Mercedes through a narrow, weathered street in Chicago's South Side, a world away from his penthouse apartment in the Gold Coast. Laundry hung from balcony railings, and the scent of various cooking spices drifted through his partially opened window. Sophia sat in the back seat, legs swinging, clutching a small bouquet of daisies she had insisted on bringing. "Is this where Aunt Luisa lives?" she asked, peering out at the brick buildings that lined the street. "Yes, Princesa," Eduardo replied, checking the address again. The contrast between this neighborhood and the exclusive enclave where Elena had grown up was stark and raised questions that had kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights. Luisa stood waiting at the door of her apartment building, her nervous smile almost apologetic. Her jeans were faded but clean, her blouse modest, and yet Eduardo felt something regal about her, a strength born of survival, not privilege. Her resemblance to Elena was staggering, but there were subtle differences too. A certain wariness in her eyes, a resilience in her posture that Elena, sheltered by wealth, had never needed to develop. Inside, the apartment was small but meticulously kept. Cookbooks filled the shelves where others might have displayed ornaments or photographs. A pot of something aromatic simmered on the stove, filling the modest space with warmth. "I'm studying gastronomy," she explained, noticing Eduardo's glance toward the kitchen. "Cleaning pays for school. You won't believe what happens next." Will Eduardo discover the truth about Elena's death? And what dark secret has Luisa been hiding all these years? Over lunch, a stew so delicious that Eduardo found himself having seconds despite his usual restraint, Luisa shared fragments of her childhood in the care system. 2 kind but struggling adoptive parents, a life on Chicago's outskirts, and a relentless longing to find her other half, the sister she'd only learned about through a slip of an administrator's tongue when she was 16. Eduardo reciprocated with what he knew of Elena's upbringing: private schools, vacations in Europe, and parents, particularly her mother, Regina Montenegro, who had buried Elena's adoption so deeply that even their closest friends believed Elena was their biological child. "But why separate us?" Luisa asked, her hands cradling a mug of coffee. "Why keep us apart?" "I don't know," Eduardo said, his jaw tightening. "But I intend to find out." Several days later, Eduardo stood in the cavernous foyer of the Montenegro family estate in Lake Forest, a palace of marble floors and oppressive silence. Regina Montenegro descended the curved staircase like a queen approaching commoners, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture impeccable despite her 70 years. "Eduardo," she said coolly, "this is unexpected. Sophia isn't due for her monthly visit until next weekend." "I'm not here about visitation," Eduardo replied, his voice controlled but edged with steel. "Elena had a sister, a twin." Regina blinked. For a moment her practiced composure cracked, revealing something raw and startled underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Lies won't work anymore," Eduardo said, stepping closer. "I found her." The confrontation unraveled a decades-old deception. Twin girls, separated at birth by what Regina coldly called practical considerations. The Montenegros, unable to conceive and desperate for an heir to their fortune, had adopted Elena. But they had deliberately left Luisa behind, deeming one child sufficient and unwilling to deal with the complications of twins. They'd buried the truth so deeply that even Elena had only discovered it days before her death. "She found Luisa's name," Eduardo said, holding up Elena's old diary, which he'd retrieved from a safety deposit box after meeting Luisa. "She was on her way to meet her the night she died." Regina's gaze flickered, something close to guilt or perhaps fear crossing her features. "That was an accident." "Was it?" Eduardo challenged, his voice dropping dangerously. "Because," I've had the police reports reviewed. The brakes were tampered with, and I intend to find out who did it. The weeks that followed spiraled into a dark maze of revelations and danger. Anonymous threats arrived at Luisa's apartment. Eduardo discovered that Regina had hired private investigators to monitor both Elena and Luisa for years. Most disturbing of all, Marcelo, the mechanic who had recently begun courting Luisa, disappeared without a trace the day after Eduardo confronted him about his connection to the Montenegro family. But in the midst of the gathering storm, something unexpected blossomed: a family. Sophia, who had spoken little since her mother's death, now chattered constantly. Luisa, who had spent years in solitary pursuit of a culinary degree, found herself surrounded by people who cared for her. And Eduardo, who had resigned himself to a half-life of work and solitary parenting, discovered that his heart hadn't completely frozen after all. One evening, as they sat in Eduardo's living room, reviewing financial records that might link Regina to the sabotage of Elena's car, Sophia climbed onto Luisa's lap and whispered, "Do you miss Mommy too?" At the end of Chapter 8, have you ever encountered someone in your life who reminded you of a person you lost? Please share your experience in the comments. Luisa's hands stilled on the papers she'd been holding. "Every day," she replied softly, brushing Sophia's dark curls away from her forehead with fingers that trembled slightly. "But I think she sent me to find you." Eduardo watched them from across the room, struck by how naturally they had formed a bond, as if the 3 years of separation had never happened. Perhaps it was genetic memory, he thought, or perhaps it was simply that Sophia, who had been too young to fully remember her mother, found comfort in Luisa's familiar features and warm laugh. The investigation into Elena's death intensified when Eduardo's private detective discovered offshore accounts in the name of Regina's longtime chauffeur, Martin Reeves. The amounts, large deposits made shortly before and after Elena's fatal accident, painted a damning picture. But proving it would require more than circumstantial evidence, especially against a family as powerful as the Montenegros. "We need to be careful," Eduardo warned Luisa one evening after Sophia had gone to bed. "Regina has connections everywhere, and if she realizes we're close to the truth—" Luisa nodded, her expression determined. "I'm not afraid," she said, though the slight tremor in her hand as she poured tea betrayed her. "For 28 years, I've wondered about my sister, about the life I might have had. I need to know what happened to her." The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Sophia, rummaging through old boxes of her mother's belongings that Eduardo had stored in the penthouse's spare bedroom, discovered a USB drive hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Pride and Prejudice, Elena's favorite novel. "Look, Daddy," she said, holding it up. "Mummy's secret thing." The drive contained a video, Eleanor, pale and serious, speaking directly to the camera. "If you're watching this," she began, "then I didn't make it back from meeting my sister. I've suspected for some time that Mother has been having me followed. Yesterday I confronted her about Luisa, and she changed. There was something in her eyes I've never seen before. I'm scared, Eduardo, but I have to meet my sister. I've arranged everything through a private investigator. His name is Jackson Morris, and he has copies of all the evidence. I've gathered about my adoption." Just when it seemed they were finally making progress, disaster struck. Eduardo returned home one evening to find his penthouse ransacked, Luisa unconscious on the kitchen floor and Sophia missing. The ransom call came an hour later as Eduardo paced the hospital corridor, waiting for Luisa to regain consciousness. "The girl is safe," a mechanically distorted voice informed him. "Destroy the evidence, all of it, and she stays that way." Is this the end of their search for truth? Who would dare kidnap an innocent child? With Sophia's life in danger, what will Eduardo and Luisa do now? Eduardo had never known such fear or such rage. He contacted the police immediately, despite the kidnappers' warnings. Detective Veronica Chen, a no-nonsense veteran of Chicago's Kidnapping and Missing Persons Unit, took command of the situation with reassuring efficiency. "Whoever did this is amateur," she told Eduardo after listening to the recorded call. "Professional kidnappers don't leave victims at the scene, and they don't make ransom demands so quickly. This smells like desperation." When Luisa regained Consciousness, her first word was Sophia, followed by a description of the intruder. Tall, thin, with a distinctive limp. "Martin," Eduardo and Detective Chen said simultaneously. They found Sophia 12 hours later, unharmed but frightened, in a maintenance room at the Montenegro estate. Martin Reeves, cornered, broke down almost immediately under interrogation. Yes, he had tampered with Elena's brakes at Regina's instruction. Yes, he had been monitoring Luisa for years. And yes, he had panicked when he realized Eduardo was close to finding proof of Regina's involvement in Elena's death. Regina Montenegro was arrested that same evening, her imperious demeanor crumbling as the handcuffs clicked into place. "She was going to ruin everything," she spat, no longer bothering to deny her role. "Bringing that cleaning woman into our family. The Montenegros have standards, traditions." "The only tradition you upheld was cruelty," Eduardo replied, his arm around Sophia, who buried her face against his side. Elena deserved to know her sister. They both deserved the truth. In the aftermath, as spring bloomed across Chicago, healing began. Sophia started therapy, slowly processing the trauma of her kidnapping and the revelation about her grandmother. Eduardo threw himself into ensuring justice for Elena, working closely with prosecutors to build an airtight case against Regina and Martin. And Luisa flourished. With the financial settlement from the Montenegro estate, money that Eduardo insisted belonged rightfully to her as Elena's twin, she completed her culinary degree and began planning her own restaurant. "I'm thinking of calling it Elena's," she told Eduardo one evening, as they sat on his penthouse balcony, watching the sunset paint Lake Michigan in shades of gold and crimson. "Would that be too much?" "I think it would be perfect," Eduardo replied, his voice catching slightly. She would be honored. What was planned as a small, intimate opening for the restaurant became something of a local sensation. Eduardo had used his business connections to secure media coverage, and Chicago's foodie community turned out in force to support the new establishment. But as Luisa stood in the center of the gleaming kitchen she had designed herself, it wasn't the favorable reviews or the packed dining room that brought tears to her eyes. It was the small hand slipping into hers. "Are you happy, Aunt Luisa?" Sophia asked, looking up at her with Elena's eyes. "Very happy, querida," Luisa replied, kneeling to embrace her niece. "Your mommy would be proud of us all, don't you think?" Across the restaurant, Eduardo watched them, his heart full. The grief that had been his constant companion for 3 years hadn't vanished, but it had transformed, making space for something new. Not replacement, never that, but continuation. A family reshaped by tragedy, but still, unmistakably a family. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the staff began cleaning up, Eduardo found Luisa standing before a photograph of Elena that hung in the restaurant's entryway. "Sometimes I talk to her," Luisa admitted quietly. "Is that strange?" "Not at all," Eduardo replied. "What do you say?" "Thank you," Luisa said simply, "for finding me, even if it wasn't the way either of us would have chosen." The grand opening of Elena's wasn't just the debut of Chicago's most anticipated new restaurant. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a shattered coffee cup and a child's innocent observation. Eduardo, once convinced his life had ended with Elena's, now stood amid the warm glow of success, surrounded by new beginnings. Sophia, resplendent in a dress she had chosen herself, moved confidently among the guests, occasionally pausing to admire her reflection in the polished surfaces of the restaurant. There was a newfound steadiness in her step, a security that came from knowing she was fiercely loved and protected, and Luisa, who had once mopped floors in silence, now commanded a kitchen with the assurance of someone who had found her true place in the world. The restaurant critics raved about her inventive take on traditional dishes, but what moved diners to return again and again was the love evident in every carefully plated creation. On the 1-year anniversary of their first meeting, Eduardo presented Luisa with a small velvet box. "This was Elena's," he said, as she opened it to reveal a delicate gold locket. Inside is a picture of her parents, her adoptive parents. I thought you might want to add a photo of your adoptive parents alongside it, to honor both of your histories. Louisa's eyes filled with tears as she embraced him. Our histories, she corrected gently. We're all connected now. As night fell over Chicago, the three of them stood together on Navy Pier, watching fireworks explode against the dark canvas of the sky. Sophia, perched on Eduardo's shoulders, gasped with delight at each burst of color. Louisa, her arm linked through Eduardo's, marveled at how profoundly life could change in a single year. "Do you think Elena knows?" she asked softly, her eyes on the glittering reflections in the lake. "I'm sure of it," Eduardo replied, his voice steady with conviction. "Wherever she is, she knows we found each other, and she's at peace." The restaurant thrived, expanding to a second location within 18 months. Sophia started first grade, her school projects often featuring drawings of her unusually large family, Daddy, Angel, Mommy, Aunt Louisa, and her adoptive grandparents on both sides. Eduardo returned to active management of his investment firm, inspired by a new sense of purpose. And on quiet evenings when the restaurant was closed and Sophia was asleep, Louisa and Eduardo would sometimes sit together in comfortable silence, each feeling the presence of the woman who had brought them together, not as a ghost between them, but as a foundation beneath them, supporting whatever might come next. "To Elena," Eduardo would sometimes say, raising his glass in a private toast. "To finding each other," Louisa would reply, her glass meeting his with a gentle chime. And somewhere beyond, Elena smiled. "Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.